The Man with the Iron Heart. How one bureaucrat engineered genocide history has its monsters. But rarely does it create one so cold, so calculated, so surgically precise in the execution of evil that even Adolf Hitler, architect of the Holocaust himself, would refer to him as the man with the iron heart. That man was Reinhard Heydrich, and he wasn't a general leading troops on the battlefield. He wasn't a loud demagogue stirring up crowds with fiery speeches. No, Heydrich was something far more insidious. He was the man in the shadows, the architect behind the systems that made mass murder efficient. To understand the nature of evil in the 20th century, you don't need to study Hitler's rhetoric. You need to study Heydrich's memos. He didn't scream hate into microphones. He typed it quietly into policy. He didn't shoot civilians in the street. He organized the transport trains to death camps. He didn't bomb cities. He built databases of human lives to be extinguished. And therein lies the terror of Reinhard Heydrich. He was the administrator of annihilation, the man who turned genocide into logistics. Born in 1904 in Halle, Germany, Reinhard Heydrich was the son of a cultured upper-middle-class family. His father was a composer. His home was filled with opera education and opportunity. He played the violin with finesse, spoke with articulation, and displayed a precocious intellect. But behind that polished exterior was a festering sense of pride and a deep emotional vulnerability that would one day twist into sadistic resolve. As a young boy, he was taunted by classmates for allegedly having Jewish ancestry and ironic and painful cruelty considering his future. These early insults stayed with him, not just emotionally, but psychologically. They burrowed deep into the identity of a boy who felt destined to prove he belonged, to be feared, to be pure. After a promising start in the German Navy, Heydrich's ambitions came crashing down. In 1931, a scandal involving a broken engagement and accusations of moral misconduct ended his career. Humiliated and dishonored, Heydrich turned to the rising force in German politics, the Nazi Party. It was there in the early years of their ascent that he found purpose, and they found their most dangerous weapon. Because Heydrich didn't just pledge loyalty to Hitler and Himmler. He offered them something far more valuable, a brilliant mind with no moral compass. Himmler immediately recognized his potential and gave him the task of building an internal intelligence division for the SS. Within weeks, Heydrich was running the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, a Nazi security and surveillance service that would infiltrate enemies' map dissenters and eventually control the entire machinery of terror. Heydrich rose quickly, not through charm but through efficiency. He wasn't flamboyant. He was cold. He was emotionless. He got the job done. And that job would soon become the coordination of the Gestapo, the Reich Main Security Office, and eventually the management of the final solution, the Nazi regime's plan to exterminate every Jewish man, woman, and child in Europe. But let's pause here, because to truly grasp the magnitude of Heydrich's evil, we have to recognize what made him different from other Nazi leaders. Most of Hitler's inner circle were ideologues or opportunists. They believed in the racial superiority of Germans, or they craved power. Heydrich believed in systems. He didn't simply want to kill his enemies. He wanted to do it more effectively. He was fascinated by efficiency. He created index cards for every known political dissident. He organized surveillance networks like an engineer mapping a machine. He viewed people as data points, units to be tracked, moved, and erased. Heydrich wasn't the Nazi shouting from the balcony. He was the man cataloging your name, scheduling your arrest, and coordinating the train that would take you to a camp with work sets you free over the gate. He made killing mechanical. This is what modern evil looks like, not rage but routine, not passion but process. When he orchestrated the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, Heydrich wasn't emotional. He was organized. Sitting in a villa outside Berlin surrounded by Nazi bureaucrats and ministry officials, Heydrich calmly explained how millions of Jews across Europe would be relocated, a euphemism that everyone in the room understood meant systematic extermination. The most chilling part, the tone of the meeting was businesslike. They discussed train schedules, manpower shortages, the legal definitions of who counted as Jewish. These weren't soldiers with blood on their boots. They were administrators in tailored uniforms processing genocide like quarterly revenue. And Heydrich was the chairman of the board. By the early 1940s, he had become arguably the most powerful man in Nazi Germany, after Hitler and Himmler. He controlled both the SS intelligence apparatus SD and the Gestapo T secret police. His reach extended into every corner of Europe that the Nazis touched. In Bohemia and Moravia, modern-day Czech Republic ruled with brutal precision. Dissent was not punished, it was eliminated. Thousands were executed without trial. Resistance fighters were tortured, entire villages burned, and the local population lived in constant fear. He earned a new name from the people he oppressed, the Butcher of Prague. But even iron hearts can crack. On May 27, 1942, as he was riding in an open-top car through Prague, ignoring all security warnings, two Czechoslovak resistance fighters launched an ambush. A grenade exploded near the car, and Heydrich was mortally wounded. He clung to life for several days but eventually died from sepsis. He was 38. It was one of the most daring acts of resistance in the war. It took two brave young men barely armed to strike down the architect of the Holocaust. But perhaps the most terrifying part of Heydrich's legacy isn't the blood on his hands. It's how little of it he spilled himself. He didn't shoot Jews in the street. He built the system that did. He didn't personally torture prisoners. He trained thousands who would. That is what makes Reinhard Heydrich so haunting. He showed us that the face of evil doesn't always snarl. Sometimes it signs the forms, delegates the orders, and keeps the trains running on time. So why tell this story now? Because there are still lessons in Heydrich's life that speak to us today. That evil isn't always loud, that it often wears a uniform, speaks in quiet tones, and calls itself necessary. And because for an older generation of Americans, many of whom grew up during what? This is more than history. It's a reminder, a call, a warning. It's the reason why stories like this must be remembered and retold, so that we never forget what happens when we let the iron-hearted write the rules. They called him the man with the iron heart, a name not given lightly even in the ranks of the Nazi elite. Reinhard Heydrich was not merely a participant in the crimes of the Third Reich. He was their architect. He didn't yell from podiums, didn't clench his fists in theatrical rage. He whispered into files, signed death warrants in ink, and turned mass murder into a logistical operation. He wasn't a beast. He was something worse, a brilliant, cold, calculating bureaucrat who made genocide efficient. Born in 1904 into a cultured German family, Heydrich was raised among violins and operas, books, and lectures. His father was a composer, his mother descended from nobility. His early life was filled with discipline and ambition, but also with bitterness. From childhood whispers haunted him, rumors of Jewish blood, schoolyard taunts that branded him with names like Moses Handel. In a Germany that would soon become obsessed with racial purity, those insults cut deeper than most could imagine. They would fester beneath the surface, planting seeds of hatred, pride, and a craving for control. He channeled his discipline into a career in the German Navy, rising quickly only to be humiliated and dismissed in 1931 after a scandal involving a broken engagement and accusations of dishonorable behavior. It was a devastating blow. The military had given him identity, structure, purpose. With that stripped away, Heydrich turned to the one force in Germany, rising fast and promising redemption to humiliated Menta Nazi Party. Within weeks of being cast out, he joined the SS and caught the eye of Heinrich Himmler, who quickly recognized the value of this icy, intelligent, deeply wounded man. Himmler didn't need more street brawlers. He needed someone who could build an empire of intelligence, surveillance, and silent terror. Heydrich was the perfect tool. Within months, he created the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, the SS's internal intelligence service. He categorized political opponents, collected dossiers, mapped out networks of dissent. He was building the nervous system of a police state. Where others in the Nazi hierarchy used rage, Heydrich used order. Where others relied on thugs, he relied on data. His ascent was rapid. By the mid-1930s, he controlled both the SD and the Gestapo. Every whisper of opposition passed through his ears. Every crackdown on trade unions, journalists, Jews, communists, it all bore his fingerprints. And as Hitler expanded Germany's borders, Heydrich expanded the reach of fear. He was instrumental in the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, and in the occupation of Czechoslovakia. He orchestrated the arrest of thousands, many of them Jews, and had their names logged, categorized, and deported. But his most terrifying achievement came in 1942 when he chaired the Wannsee Conference. In a quiet villa outside Berlin, Heydrich and a group of top Nazi officials calmly discussed the final solution to the Jewish question. It was the day the Holocaust became official state policy. There was no shouting, no chaos. Just men in uniforms discussing train timetables, head counts, and definitions. Heydrich led with chilling professionalism. He used the language of order resettlement, processing relocational euphemisms for death. Under his leadership, genocide became a paperwork exercise. Millions of Jews, including the elderly, women, and children, were to be rounded up, transported to concentration camps, and exterminated. The system Heydrich designed was ruthlessly effective. Victims were log-labeled assigned numbers and sent east in cattle cars. Camps like Auschwitz-Treblinka and Sobibor became death factories, killing thousands per day. Heydrich didn't oversee the gas chambers himself. He didn't pull the levers. But every timetable, every deportation list, every administrative directive that made those deaths possible bore his mark. He understood the power of systems, and he weaponized that knowledge. In 1941, Hitler sent Heydrich to govern the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, modern-day Czech Republic. There, Heydrich ruled with an iron fist. In just months, hundreds were executed, thousands arrested. Resistance was crushed, and Jewish families disappeared overnight. He became known as the Butcher of Prague. Yet he saw himself not as a brute, but as a reformer. He implemented labor reforms to buy loyalty from Czech workers, even as he sent their neighbors to die. He wanted to show Berlin that he could pacify a region not with chaos, but with control. It was this control that made him so dangerous. He wasn't erratic. He was precise. But tyranny, no matter how orderly, always breeds resistance. In December 1941, the Czech government in exile, based in London, approved a bold plan to assassinate Heydrich. The mission was codenamed Operation Anthropoid. Two young Czech paratroopers, Josef Gabek and Jan Kuby, parachuted into their homeland and spent months preparing. They tracked his movements, studied his routines, waited. On May 27, 1942, as Heydrich's open-top car slowed around a curve in Prague, Gabek stepped forward and aimed his Sten gun. It jammed. Heydrich, rather than ordering his driver to speed away, stood to draw his pistol. That's when Kuby threw the grenade. It exploded beside the car, sending shrapnel through Heydrich's body. He didn't die instantly. He was taken to a hospital. Surgeons removed his spleen. He lingered for days. Hitler sent Himmler to his bedside. For a time, it seemed he might recover. But then came fever, infection, sepsis. On June 4, 1942, Reinhard Heydrich, the man with the iron heart, was dead. He was 38. The Nazis responded with terror. Entire villages were wiped out. The town of Heydrich was burned, its male population executed, women and children sent to camps. Thousands across Bohemia and Moravia were arrested or killed in a wave of reprisals. The funeral in Berlin was elaborate. Heydrich's body lay in state. Goebbels orchestrated every detail for maximum propaganda effect. Hitler laid the blood order medal, the Nazi Party's highest honor, in his coffin. And yet behind closed doors, Hitler was reportedly furious. Furious that such a key official had allowed himself to be killed. Furious that the Iron Heart had failed. But Heydrich's legacy did not die with him. The systems he built continued. The trains kept running. The camps remained full. The killing intensified. Adolf Eichmann, his Prot, would carry out the logistics of genocide to the bitter end. And for decades after the war, historians and survivors alike would agree no man did more to enable the Holocaust than Reinhard Heydrich. He was not a madman. He was not out of control. That's what makes him so terrifying. He was calm, composed, deadly by design. In many ways, Heydrich teaches us that evil isn't always loud. Sometimes it wears a well-pressed uniform, speaks perfect German, and files reports on time. Sometimes it doesn't shout at all, it calculates. He didn't fire the gun. He created the checklist. He didn't set the fire. He lit the system that spread it. And perhaps that is what history should remember most. Because in every society and every age, there are men and women like Heydrich, orderly, obedient, ambitious, and void of empathy. They don't look like monsters, but give them power and they will build monstrosities. The question isn't whether evil like this can happen again. The question is, would we recognize it before it's too late? Would we see it in the spreadsheet, the memo, the quiet nod from a man behind the desk? That's why this story matters. Not just to remember the victims, but to understand the machinery. not just to condemn the horrors, but to trace the wires that made it all work. Because Reinhard Heydrich didn't only carry out the Holocaust, he designed the user interface. He made murder scalable. He made it feel like management. And that is the most chilling lesson of all. The rise of a bureaucratic empire. How Heydrich built the machinery of terror. Reinhard Heydrich did not begin as a man of blood. He began as a man of paper, of memos, of protocols, of organizational charts. He didn't wield a weapon, he wielded a filing cabinet. But in a nation descending into ideological madness, that was enough. Because Heydrich understood something that most men of his time, and many men still never fully grasped in the right hands, bureaucracy can become a weapon far more lethal than bullets. By the time the 1930s unfurled across a broken Germany, the nation had grown desperate for order. Economic collapse, political instability, the humiliation of Versailles all had created a pressure cooker. Hitler provided the rage. Himmler provided the doctrine. But it was Heydrich who would provide the system. The Nazis didn't just need to win power. They needed to keep it, enforce it, and build a state that would root out opposition with methodical precision. That state would require surveillance, intelligence, internal policing. It would require a new kind of institution, one not based on justice but on suspicion, not on truth but on ideology. And Heydrich, freshly expelled from the Navy and desperate to redeem his honor, was the perfect man for the job. It started small. In 1931, Heinrich Himmler tasked Heydrich with creating an internal intelligence agency for the SS. It would be called the Sicherheitsdienst, or SD, the Security Service. At first, it was a skeleton crew. Heydrich worked out of a cramped office with a single typewriter and no staff. But what he lacked in infrastructure, he made up for in vision. His idea was radical: create a centralized intelligence apparatus capable of identifying and eliminating every threat, real or perceived, to the Nazi Party. That meant not just monitoring political opponents, but monitoring everyone: professors, artists, clergy, foreign diplomats, party members themselves. Anyone could be a traitor. Everyone needed to be watched. And so Heydrich began to build. He constructed dossiers. He cross-referenced names. He developed a massive card index system, primitive by today's standards but revolutionary in its time. It allowed the SD to track an individual's ideological loyalty associations, writings, and public behavior with chilling efficiency. This wasn't mere data collection. It was the industrialization of suspicion. As the Nazi Party surged in the 1930 elections, rising from fringe obscurity to the second largest party in the Reichstag, Heydrich's methods found powerful allies. His network expanded, funding increased, more agents were recruited, and by the time Hitler was appointed chancellor in January 1933, the SD had transformed from a desk-bound experiment into a sprawling intelligence arm of the Nazi state. But the SD was just the beginning. Hitler's rise to power triggered a feverish reorganization of German society. Every ministry, every department, every profession was to be coordinated under the Nazi vision. The police were no exception. And in 1934, as part of a dramatic internal purge, Heydrich's influence multiplied. In the aftermath of the Night of the Long Knives, a brutal crackdown in which the Nazi regime executed hundreds of perceived internal threats, including top SA leadership, Heydrich emerged with greater authority than ever. His loyalty had been proven, his ruthlessness praised. Himmler, now head of the German police, moved swiftly to consolidate all police forces under SS control. The Gestapo, feared secret state police, was absorbed into this structure, and guess who was placed in command? Reinhard Heydrich. Now he didn't just run the SD, he also ran the Gestapo, placing both intelligence gathering and enforcement under a single icy grip. The Gestapo was unlike any police force the world had ever known. It had no obligation to operate within the bounds of law. It required no warrants. It was not subject to judicial oversight. It answered only to the SS and, by extension, to Heydrich himself. Its officers operated in plain clothes with unlimited authority to interrogate, detain, or execute. The mere mention of its name induced silence in cafes, schools, churches, and train stations. But Heydrich didn't just use the Gestapo to punish dissent. He used it to reshape the soul of the nation. Through terror, yes, but also through structure. He compiled lists of un-German books. He compiled rosters of racially inferior school teachers. He crafted blacklists of musicians, playwrights, and political commentators. The Gestapo didn't merely crush resistance. It designed a new society by removing anything that didn't fit its mold. Every file, every name, every decision, it all flowed through Heydrich, and he loved it. By the late 1930s, his empire had become vast. In 1939, following the invasion of Poland, this empire was formalized into a new organization, the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, or Reichssicherheit Reich Security Main Office. This sprawling body absorbed the SD, the Gestapo, and all criminal police departments. It was divided into departments with clinical names: Department I for Administration, Department II for Ideological Investigation, Department III for Ethnic German Affairs, Department 4 for the Gestapo, including subdivision, Fru B4, headed by a young man named Adolf Eichmann, responsible for Jewish affairs. At the top of it all, sitting in his Berlin headquarters, with portraits of Prussian generals on the wall, was Heydrich, the spider at the center of the web, the master planner. But this wasn't just about control, it was about preparation. Germany by 1939 was preparing for a new war, and Heydrich's empire was preparing not just to win that war, but to cleanse the territories it conquered. That meant eliminating Jews, Roma Slavs, political opponents, homosexuals, the disabled, and anyone else deemed undesirable. It was a chilling expansion of scope. In Poland, he directed the intelligence action and operation that targeted the country's intellectuals, clergy, and elite for execution. Tens of thousands were murdered in forests and back alleys. It wasn't chaotic. It was calculated. Lists were drawn up before the invasion even began. Back in Berlin, Heydrich tasked Eichmann with developing a plan to remove Europe's Jews. At first, this meant forced immigration. Madagascar was proposed, then mass deportations to the east. But as the war dragged on and more Jews came under Nazi control, new conclusion was reached: elimination. And so began the planning for the final solution. But before that phrase became infamous, it began as a logistical problem. How do you move millions of people from their homes to isolated camps? How do you identify them, process them, feed them, kill them? Heydrich answered each question. He introduced standardized identity cards. He required Jews to wear the Yellow Star of David. He coordinated with the Reichsbahn, the German railway system, to schedule transports. He created administrative flowcharts for processing arrivals. He instructed camp commandants on handling labor selections, and he kept meticulous records, always meticulous. The genocide was horrifying, but in Heydrich's hands it was also efficient. It is this efficiency that continues to horrify historians, because Heydrich proved that mass murder need not be chaotic. It can be clean, paper-driven, scheduled, normalized. He wasn't a butcher swinging an axe. He was a project manager with a clipboard. He didn't scream orders. He signed approvals. He didn't dehumanize his victims in speeches. He removed their names from files. And in doing so, he created a blueprint for modern totalitarianism, one that has haunted governments and scholars ever since. Heydrich's genius, if it can be called that, was in seeing murder as infrastructure. He built an entire ecosystem for human destruction, identification, transport, containment, extermination. Each part interconnected, each component optimized. Even Adolf Eichmann himself, a key architect of the Holocaust later, testified at his trial in Jerusalem that Heydrich was the spirit behind the final solution. I was only following the structures he had already put in place. By the time of the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, it was all in motion. Heydrich gathered top officials from across Nazi ministries not to debate the final solution, but to finalize its execution. He spoke calmly, authoritatively, with charts and maps. There was no shouting, no moral panic, just procedural alignment. In less than 90 minutes, the machinery of genocide was confirmed. The world often looks for monsters, but Reinhard Heydrich wasn't monstrous in appearance. He was handsome, articulate, athletic. He fenced, piloted planes, played the violin. He smiled politely, shook hands, firmly wrote poetry. He dined with diplomats. That's what makes him so terrifying. He wasn't an aberration. He was a function, not chaos, but calculated evil. He taught the world a dreadful lesson. You don't need chaos to commit atrocity. You only need a man who knows how to build a system and has no soul. Heydrich's empire didn't crumble when he died. But without his cold hand at the wheel, the system began to fray. It became reactive, more chaotic, less exact. The efficiency suffered, but the horror did not end. To this day, the RSHA is studied not just by historians, but by political scientists, legal scholars, and intelligence experts, trying to understand how a nation of philosophers and engineers could descend into such methodical cruelty. And time and again, the same name returns: Reinhardt Heydrich, the man who turned death into a department. The architect of extermination, Heydrich, and the birth of the final solution. By the early 1940s, Reinhard Heydrich had become the spider at the center of the Nazi web. He had transformed from a disgraced naval officer into the undisputed master of intelligence and state terror within the Third Reich. With the Reich Main Security Office RSHA under his control, he held dominion over the Gestapo, the SD, the Kripo, and all mechanisms of domestic surveillance and persecution. His reach extended from Berlin to the edges of Nazi-occupied Europe. But his true legacy, the shadow he would cast for generations, was not simply the construction of a fearsome, bureaucratic state. It was the decision to turn that machinery toward a singular goal: the complete annihilation of European Jewry. Heydrich was never merely a cog in the Nazi machine. He was its coldest mind. His brilliance was not in military conquest or ideological rhetoric. It lay in his ability to reduce atrocity into action steps. While other Nazi leaders saw the Jewish people as enemies or subhumans, Heydrich saw them as a problem to be solved. A matter of logistics, of railways, camp capacity, food rations, and bullet shortages. His great contribution to the Nazi state was to make genocide feel like administration. The seeds of extermination had been planted early. As soon as Hitler came to power in 1933, Jews across Germany were increasingly stripped of their rights. First from government positions, then from universities, then from professions like law and medicine. The infamous Nuremberg laws of 1935 forbade marriage between Jews and non-Jews and revoked their citizenship. It was slow, deliberate isolation designed to degrade, impoverish, and eventually force them to flee. But as the Nazi Empire expanded across Europe, this strategy proved insufficient. With the annexation of Austria in 1938 and the occupation of Czechoslovakia in 1939, Germany found itself with hundreds of thousands of new Jewish citizens. The outbreak of war in Poland brought millions more. The emigration strategy, once promoted by Adolf Eichmann under Heydrich's supervision, was quickly becoming impossible. No country wanted to take in such massive numbers of refugees. British control over the seas made overseas deportation unfeasible. And most critically, as Germany tightened its grip on Europe, the Nazi leadership became convinced that a more final solution would be necessary. In October 1939, Heydrich proposed a new plan for Jewish resettlement. He spoke of forced deportations to remote areas in occupied Poland, where ghettos would be established to hold millions of Jews under guard. His language was clinical. He made no mention of executions, no explicit calls for death. But in practice, these ghettos became holding zones for starvation disease and the first steps toward mass murder. In the ghettos of Warsaw, Lodz, Krakow, and Lublin, hundreds of thousands of Jews were packed into walled-off slums. Food was rationed to starvation levels. Medical care was non-existent. The SS monitored all communications and movements. Slowly but steadily, entire populations were being reduced to ghosts. It was not yet the Holocaust in its final form, but it was unmistakably a rehearsal. Heydrich watched this with precision. He studied reports on mortality rates. He monitored uprisings. He refined methods of control. At the same time, his pro-TG Eichmann worked on schemes to deport Jews to Madagascar, then a French colony imagining a massive relocation plan where Jews would be isolated on an island far from Europe. It was absurd, logistically impossible, and transparently inhumane. But it revealed the Nazi mindset that Jewish life was a problem to be outsourced, removed, or erased. Then came June 1941, the turning point. Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The war expanded dramatically. Suddenly, the Nazis had control over vast new territories: Belarus, Ukraine, the Baltic states, with millions more Jews under their dominion. These were not citizens of the Reich. They were not protected by even the thin veil of legal process. They were viewed by Hitler and his inner circle as racial enemies, communist sympathizers, and expendable lives. And in these conquered lands, the SS began to test a new kind of solution: mass shooting operations. Heydrich dispatched Einsatzgruppen mobile killing squads comprised of SS men, Gestapo officers, and collaborators from local fascist groups. Their orders were clear: follow the Wehrmacht into the East Rhine, up Jews, Roma, political commissars, and execute them. No trials, no deportations, just bullets and pits. Villages were liquidated. Rabbis and children were shot. Women were forced to strip before being gunned down in forests. Entire communities disappeared in the span of a day. The worst of these massacres occurred at Babi Yar, a ravine near Kiev, where over 33,000 Jews were murdered in 2 days in September 1941. They were stripped, led in small groups, and executed over open graves. The efficiency shocked even hardened SS men. It was the single largest mass shooting by German forces during the war, and Heydrich received detailed reports of every shot fired. But mass shootings had problems. They were emotionally taxing for the executioners. They used enormous amounts of ammunition. They weren't scalable across the entire continent. And so by the autumn of 1941, a new consensus emerged at the highest levels of the Nazi regime. Extermination needed to be systematized. It needed to be industrial. Gas. The method had already been tested. Since 1939, under the T4 euthanasia program, mentally disabled Germans had been murdered using carbon monoxide in sealed chambers. The victims were told they were being taken for showers or medical exams. They were led into chambers disguised as bathrooms and then gassed. The program killed over 70,000 people before public protests forced its cancellation. But within the SS, it had proven the method's viability. And now in late 1941, it would be repurposed on a scale never before imagined. Heydrich, as head of the RSHA, was charged by Hermann Göring with coordinating a total solution of the Jewish question in Europe. That meant full control across occupied territory and within Germany itself of all Jews and their fate. And so he convened a conference. On January 20th, 1942, 15 men gathered at Villa Wannsee, a serene lakeside estate in the suburbs of Berlin. The purpose of the meeting was not to decide the final solution. That decision had already been made. The goal was to coordinate the administration of genocide. Heydrich led the meeting with calm authority. He outlined the scope: 11 million Jews across Europe, from Portugal to the Soviet Union, were to be evacuated to the east. He explained the categories: Jews by race, by marriage, by religious practice. He addressed exemptions, then dismissed them. He discussed transportation schedules, camp construction, and labor potentials. And when he finished, the meeting closed with a light lunch and cognac. The records of the Wannsee Conference show no argument, no objection, no crisis of conscience. The men present were not psychopaths or soldiers. They were lawyers, clerks, mid-level officials. They nodded, took notes, asked about definitions. They were concerned about jurisdictional overlap. They weren't debating genocide, they were managing it. Heydrich's brilliance at Wannsee wasn't in cruelty. It was in his ability to make murder sound manageable, to present extermination as paperwork, to give state-sponsored genocide the flavor of policy rollout. And in doing so, he guaranteed the cooperation of every arm of the Nazi state, from the foreign ministry to the rail ministry, from labor departments to regional governors. The Holocaust that followed was not just horrifying, it was coordinated. Trains departed on time. Jews were cataloged, herded, and shipped. Camps were built not to punish, but to process. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Hise weren't prisons. They were factories of death. And at the center of it all was Heydrich. He didn't need to be on the platform selecting who lived and died. He had already selected the system. He didn't need to handle a rifle. He had already designed the rail cars. His genius was in making the Holocaust a network part, invisibly linked, each cog essential, each life reduced to a line on a chart. What makes Heydrich so terrifying isn't just that he helped kill millions. It's that he did so with such emotional detachment. There are no recorded moments of doubt, no second thoughts. He believed fully in the racial ideology of the Reich. He saw Jews as parasitic, corrupting, and inferior. But more than that, he saw them as data. And perhaps this is the most chilling legacy he left behind. That genocide can be done without hatred in the traditional sense. that a man who plays the violin, who speaks in complete sentences, who enjoys the company of artists and philosophers, can also build a system to kill children by the thousands. Even among his peers, Heydrich stood apart. Heinrich Himmler, his superior, was in awe of his competence. Adolf Hitler praised his iron will. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, called him the perfect Nazi. No one within the Nazi elite was more efficient, more respected, more feared. And yet behind his desk, Heydrich may have believed he was just doing a job, solving a problem, managing a crisis. His calm was not the absence of cruelty, it was its final form. What followed the Wannsee Conference was a disaster for humanity. Within months, deportations increased. Ghettos were emptied. Jews were packed into freight trains and sent to newly built gas chambers in the forests of Poland. In places like Belzec Sobibor and Treblinka, over 1.5 million people would die in less than 2 years, most within hours of arriving. In Auschwitz alone, over 1 million Jews would be murdered by the end of the war. And though Heydrich would not live to see the full outcome of his solution, he had already drawn the blueprints. The Butcher of Prague, Heydrich's Reign of Terror, and The Day the Devil Bled. By 1941, Reinhard Heydrich had already earned a fearsome reputation throughout Europe. Within the Third Reich, he was known as the brain behind the Reich Security Main Office, RSRA, the mastermind of the intelligence web that blanketed Nazi Germany and its occupied territories. He had designed the final solution. He had terrorized the Jews, crushed the political opposition, and turned bureaucratic order into a weapon of unspeakable cruelty. But as ruthless as his record was, Heydrich was still viewed by many in Hitler's inner circle as a man whose talents were too great to be confined to Berlin. He was in the eyes of his superiors more than a desk-bound technocrat. He was a conqueror in waiting. On September 27, 1941, Adolf Hitler appointed Heydrich to a new post, Deputy Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia, the remains of Czechoslovakia after its dismemberment by the Nazi regime. The region centered around Prague was a vital industrial and political hub, rich in armaments and skilled labor. Though nominally still under the authority of the aging puppet president, Emil Hácha, true power rested with the Reich Protector. And now, with Heydrich's appointment, the Iron Heart had been given a kingdom to crush. It was perhaps the cruelest irony in Heydrich's career. His most visible and direct command would not be over a war zone, but over an ancient, proud European capital, the city of 100 spires, Prague, a jewel of art, culture, and resistance. When Heydrich arrived, the Czech population lived under a thin veil of civility. Previous Nazi governors had maintained an uneasy balance, brutalizing dissenters, but tolerating a degree of daily life. Resistance was growing, but morale among Nazi officials was low. Factories were underperforming, railways were being sabotaged, anti-German graffiti appeared daily, and the Czech people, while outwardly compliant, had not broken. Heydrich would change all that. He came not as a governor, but as a predator. In his first official statements, he promised iron discipline and German order. Within 48 hours, he suspended most Czech political parties. Within weeks, he began mass arrests targeting Czech cultural leaders, educators, clergy, and former members of the military. Entire families were taken. Courts were bypassed. Summary executions became routine. Under Heydrich's orders, martial law was declared. Thousands were arrested in Prague alone. The Gestapo worked day and night interrogating suspects, extracting names, drawing maps of underground cells. Executions were carried out with clinical efficiency. The gallows ran daily. Bodies were left displayed in town squares as warnings. A new nickname emerged among the Czech people, the Butcher of Prague. But Heydrich was no mere thug. His cruelty was calculated. He understood the psychology of occupation. He knew fear alone wouldn't be enough. So he offered selective rewards. Wages were raised in factories. Rationing was temporarily eased. He gave radio speeches promising protection to the loyal Czech worker. He portrayed himself as a paternal figure, stern, but just. And it worked. Industrial output soared. Resistance movements were forced underground. Fear mixed with fatigue, and for a time Heydrich had Prague in his fist. It was a masterclass in modern dictatorship, a hybrid of terror and propaganda. He was building what Nazi officials called a model protectorate, and Berlin took notice. Himmler praised Heydrich's efficiency. Hitler admired his nerve. Some even speculated that Heydrich was being groomed for greater things, to run all of Eastern Europe, perhaps even replace Himmler one day. But not everyone was watching in awe. Across the Channel in London, the Czechoslovak government, in exile by President Edvard Beneš, growing increasingly desperate. The Allies still viewed Czechoslovakia as little more than a conquered land. There was little attention, little aid, and fading hope. Ben needed a dramatic gesture, something to remind the world that Czechoslovakia was not defeated, that it still had warriors, still had teeth. The answer came in the form of Operation Anthropoid. In the fall of 1941, with British support, a daring plan was hatched to assassinate Reinhard Heydrich, the highest-ranking Nazi official ever targeted by resistance forces during the war. It was a suicide mission in all but name, but it was also a mission meant to change history. Two men were chosen, Josef Gabak and Jan Kuby, young soldiers in exile, who had trained with the British Special Operations Executive SOE. They were brave, disciplined, and utterly committed. On December 28, 1941, they parachuted into Czechoslovakia under the cover of darkness, landing in fields outside Plzeň. From there, they made their way to Prague, hiding among sympathizers and coordinating with the local resistance. For 5 months, they trained, observed, and planned. Heydrich's schedule was predictable, another testament to his arrogance. Each morning, he traveled from his villa in Panensk Brany to Prague Castle, seated in an open-top Mercedes-Benz. He refused escorts, refused armored protection. He believed, like many tyrants, in his own invincibility. On May 27, 1942, the day came. Shortly after 10:30 a.m., Heydrich's car approached a sharp curve in the Lieben district of Prague near the Bulovka Hospital. As it slowed, Gabk stepped forward with a Sten submachine gun, but the weapon jammed. For a split second, Heydrich hesitated. Then, in a moment of arrogance or sheer discipline, he stood up and reached for his pistol. That hesitation gave Jan Kuby his chance. From behind a nearby bush, Kuby hurled a modified anti-tank grenade at the car. It exploded beside the right rear wheel, sending shrapnel into the vehicle and into Heydrich. The car skidded. Heydrich collapsed. Though gravely wounded, Heydrich remained conscious. He ordered his driver to pursue the attackers, who fled into the city. Moments later, he collapsed in the street. The damage was internal. Shrapnel had pierced his diaphragm, spleen, and lung. He was rushed to Bulovka Hospital, the very institution he passed each day with indifference. Their Nazi doctors fought to save him. For a time, it seemed they had succeeded. Surgeons removed the spleen. Heydrich began to recover. Reports from Berlin claimed he was sitting up, even joking. Himmler visited. Hitler sent flowers. But on June 4, 1942, 8 days after the attack, Reinhard Heydrich died of septicemia. The infection had spread. The Iron Heart had finally stopped. The reaction from Berlin was apocalyptic. Hitler was furious. He demanded reprisals so severe that they would make the world tremble. Nazi authorities declared a state of emergency. Thousands were arrested. Resistance cells were tortured into revealing contacts. The Czech population was told they would pay in blood for every drop spilled from Heydrich's body. Then came Lidice, a small village west of Prague. Lidice had no proven connection to the assassins, but rumors, false ones, circulated that it had harbored partisans. On June 10, 1942, Nazi forces arrived. They rounded up 173 men and executed them on the spot. Women were deported to Ravensbrück concentration camp. Children were separated from their mothers, most sent to Chelmno extermination camp, where they were murdered with gas. The village itself was razed to the ground. Houses, burned church, demolished graves, dug up the very earth plowed under, as if Lidice had never existed. A second village, Leki, met the same fate weeks later. Across Bohemia and Moravia, over 5,000 people were arrested. Hundreds were executed. The Nazis were determined to erase not just the killers, but the very idea of resistance. Heydrich's funeral, held in Berlin, was a macabre spectacle. His body lay in state. Hitler personally attended. Speeches were made. Goebbels compared him to fallen war heroes. But even as they mourned him, the Nazi elite understood something darker. The most efficient monster they had created was gone. Heydrich's death left a vacuum. The final solution continued, but without his methodical mind at the helm, cracks began to form. His successor, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, lacked Heydrich's cold brilliance. Coordination suffered. Rivalries intensified. Eichmann continued the deportations, but the system never again operated with the terrifying precision it had under Heydrich. And yet his legacy endured, not just in the destruction he unleashed, but in the lessons he left behind. That tyranny doesn't need chaos. That genocide can be organized with charts and maps. That evil can wear a pressed uniform and speak in perfect grammar. In killing Reinhard Heydrich, the Czech resistance struck a blow not just against Nazi rule, but against the myth of invincibility, against the idea that the Third Reich could not be touched. His death inspired other nations to rise. It proved that even the most protected regimes are vulnerable, that even devils bleed. Today, statues of Gabok and Kubi stand in Prague. Schools are named after them. Their courage is etched in stone. But the scars of Heydrich's reign, the graves of Lidis, the silence of those who vanished, the terror that hung over Prague, remain part of Czech memory. For history must remember not just the murderers, but those who dared to stop them. Ghost in the Machine, the death of Heydrich and the Nazi system that wouldn't die. When Reinhard Heydrich died on June 4, 1942, the earth did not sigh in relief. It screamed, not because the architect of the Holocaust had fallen, but because the world was about to witness what his absence truly meant. His funeral, grand and chilling, was held in the heart of Nazi Berlin. His body was transported in an ornate coffin. Black uniformed SS officers lined the streets. Adolf Hitler himself placed a blood order medal upon Heydrich's chest, calling him the man with the iron heart. For the regime, it was the loss of one of its most brilliant minds. For the occupied people of Europe, it was not yet a victory, it was a beginning of reckoning. Because Reinhard Heydrich may have been dead, but his systems were very much alive. In Prague, the streets still ran red. In the days after his assassination, the Nazis unleashed an unprecedented wave of brutality. Over 5,000 people were arrested. Families disappeared overnight. Public executions were held in the city square. His death was not treated as the loss of a man, it was treated as a crime against a god. And from that wound, the Reich bled rage. But rage alone wasn't Heydrich's true legacy. His genius and his horror was that he had built something that could live without him. Unlike many of Hitler's lieutenants who relied on charisma, force of personality, or brute power, Heydrich had created a self-sustaining system, a bureaucratic machine of terror that could run on signatures and silence. The Reich Security Main Office, RSHA, which he had founded and refined, did not collapse in his absence. It adjusted. It adapted. It followed the blueprints he had left behind: layered hierarchies, interlocking departments, decentralized decision-making, veiled in central authority. He had not created chaos. He had created continuity. The first man to step into Heydrich's shadow was Ernst Kaltenbrunner, a towering Austrian lawyer with none of Heydrich's icy composure. Kaltenbrunner assumed leadership of the RSHA in January 1943. He was loyal, brutal, and ambitious, but not an innovator. Where Heydrich had refined the mechanisms of control, Kaltenbrunner simply allowed them to continue. He inherited a killing machine already in motion, and he kept it running. In Poland, the extermination camps of Auschwitz, Sobibor, Belzec, and Treblinka were operating at peak efficiency. The gas chambers were killing thousands each day. Trainloads of Jewish families were arriving from France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Hungary. The final solution, which Heydrich had coordinated and legitimized through the Wannsee Conference, did not falter after his death. It accelerated. Between 1942 and 1944, the Holocaust reached its most lethal phase. More than 3 million Jews were murdered during this period alone. And while Heydrich's corpse decayed beneath a swastika-draped grave, his vision thrived, cold, methodical, mechanized. And yet something had shifted. Heydrich's absence created a vacuum in leadership that no one could truly fill. Kaltenbrunner lacked strategic foresight. Himmler, though still powerful, became increasingly distracted by mystical ideas and irrational military goals. Hitler began to withdraw, increasingly isolated in his bunkers and compounds. Within the SS, rivalries flourished. The clarity and discipline that Heydrich had imposed began to fray. But this wasn't immediately visible. The trains still ran. The files still moved. Eichmann, Heydrich's protégé, was busier than ever coordinating the deportation of Hungarian Jews in 1944, one of the last and largest mass deportation campaigns of the war. Over 400,000 people were sent to Auschwitz in just 2 months. Heydrich's influence was so deeply embedded that even in his absence, those he trained, Those he inspired continued his mission with terrifying devotion. This is what makes Heydrich's legacy so unique among the architects of the Nazi regime. He did not rely on cult of personality. He wasn't a Hitler or a Goebbels or even a Himmler. His power wasn't loud. It was coded into process, into forms, into orders stamped and passed from desk to desk. He created a genocide that did not require his constant supervision. The SS officers he trained were not fanatics in the usual sense. They were technocrats, men who believed in order, duty, and efficiency, men who did not scream hatred in the streets, but who worked quietly in offices typing the names of those marked for death. Heydrich's great evil was not in rage, but in detachment, and it was this detachment that allowed his system to endure. Even as the war turned against Germany, even as the Allies landed in Italy, bombed Berlin, and prepared for the invasion of France, the machinery of extermination kept humming. It had its own rhythm, its own bureaucracy. Heydrich had created a genocide on autopilot, but his absence was still felt in the subtle erosion of discipline, in the increasing desperation of Nazi leadership, in the missed opportunities for adaptation. As Soviet troops advanced from the east and American forces from the west, cracks began to appear. By late 1944, the cost of war had become unsustainable. German rail lines were being destroyed. Fuel was in short supply. Camps were being overrun. Even then, the SS tried to continue the slaughter. Death marches were ordered. Thousands of Jews were forced to walk westward as the Nazis abandoned camps in the face of advancing armies. Many died along the way from starvation, disease, and execution, but even the most terrifying machines eventually run out of fuel. By May 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered. Hitler was dead. Himmler, attempting to flee under a false identity, was captured by British forces and committed suicide. Kaltenbrunner was arrested, tried at Nuremberg, and hanged for war crimes. Eichmann fled to Argentina, where he lived in hiding for years before being captured by Israeli agents and tried in 1961. But what of Heydrich? He had died 3 years before the Reich collapsed. He never saw the camps liberated. He never faced justice. He was buried a hero in the eyes of the regime, and yet his name became synonymous not with glory, but with pure, calculated evil. In the post-war years, historians began to trace the machinery of the Holocaust not to Hitler alone, but to the silent, faceless offices of the RSHA, to the memos and charts, to the administrative minds that had turned human life into policy. And time and again, the trail led back to one name, Reinhardt Heydrich. He was the ghost in the machine, the phantom architect, the man who showed the world that evil does not always come wearing a monster's face. Sometimes it wears a well-tailored uniform. Sometimes it signs memos. Sometimes it quotes poetry and plays the violin. And yet it kills more efficiently than any army. In the decades since, scholars have debated what makes a man like Heydrich possible. Was he a sociopath? A product of his time? A patriot gone mad? His own childhood was filled with discipline and humiliation, whispers about his ancestry, rumors of Jewish heritage, a desperate drive to prove his purity. Perhaps his rise was his revenge. Or perhaps he was simply the worst-case scenario of German order and ambition. What is clear is this: he was not insane. He was not out of control. He did not act in isolation. He acted within a system. He created that system, and he made sure that it would outlive him. That is the legacy of Reinhard Heydrich. He proved that tyranny does not need to scream, that genocide can wear a tie, that a man with clean hands can direct a world's worth of blood. After the war, Czechoslovakia erected memorials to the victims of Heydrich's regime. The village of Heydrich, raised in retaliation for his assassination, was never rebuilt in the same place. It was left as a scar, a field of silence and remembrance. A new lighthouse was constructed nearby, but the old ground was kept sacred, not as ruins but as warning. To this day, visitors come to see it, to walk the grass where homes once stood, to see the photos of children taken never return, to stand where an entire community was erased, not because of war, but because of one man's death, one man's life. Reinhard Heydrich may not have lived to see the end of his vision, but the world did, and it has not forgotten. His name is not spoken with pride. It is spoken with caution, with trembling, with the awareness that systems matter, that design matters, that evil can be coded, scalable, and self-sustaining. Heydrich died, but his ghost, his machine kept killing, and that is the most chilling lesson of all. Echoes of the Iron Heart reckoning with the legacy of Reinhardt Heydrich history is not merely a ledger of dates and battles, it is a mirror, often cruel, often uncomfortable, held up to the soul of humanity. And in that mirror, few reflections are darker than that of Reinhard Heydrich, a man whose legacy is not measured in speeches or medals, but in the cold, mechanized destruction of human life. His name, whispered even decades after his death, does not inspire admiration. It inspires awe, fear, and revulsion. Heydrich was not the head of state. He never led armies across borders. He did not possess the volcanic charisma of Adolf Hitler or the public theatrics of Joseph Goebbels. His genius was quieter and infinitely more dangerous. He did not build monuments. He built systems, and systems, unlike men, do not bleed. After his assassination in 1942, the world continued to spin. The war raged on. The camps expanded. The trains kept running. The executions accelerated. For a brief moment, it seemed his death had done nothing to halt the Nazi juggernaut. But in time, historians, prosecutors, theologians, and survivors would all arrive at the same terrifying conclusion: Heydrich had designed a machine that could kill without him. In many ways, his death became a metaphor for the broader challenge of reckoning with totalitarianism in the modern world. The man was gone, but his fingerprints remain on the files, on the rail schedules, on the protocols of the SS, and most tragically in the graves of millions. Post-war trials like Nuremberg focused on individual guilt: Kaltenbrunner, Gring, Eichmann. But Heydrich's ghost was harder to prosecute. He left no battlefield, no manifesto, only memos, minutes, orders. His weapon had been administration, a genocide carried out not by lunatics but by civil servants. That's the first great lesson the world had to face after the war. Evil doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers in bureaucratic language. Heydrich understood that if you want to commit horrors at scale, you don't need rage. You need process. When he chaired the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, he didn't pound the table or scream epithets. He spoke with calm authority, referencing statistics, labor availability, transportation, logistics. The final solution was not born in fire and fury, it was born in a villa with coffee and cognac. That meeting would come to symbolize a new kind of evil one that was cold, organized, and entirely ordinary in its appearance. In fact, much of what Heydrich engineered has haunted legal and moral scholars ever since. Philosopher Hannah Arendt, covering the trial of Adolf Eichmann in the 1960s, coined the now famous phrase, the banality of evil. Eichmann, a key executor of Heydrich's policies, insisted he was just following orders, implementing a system he did not invent. And therein lies the legacy. Heydrich built the template for moral disengagement. He allowed others to kill without ever confronting the blood on their hands. He made murder feel like maintenance. The second great lesson the world has drawn from Heydrich's life is this: it is possible to be brilliant, cultured, and capable, and still be a monster. Heydrich was no backwater thug. He played the violin at a near-professional level. He read Goethe. He spoke several languages. He was articulate, well-groomed, and capable of speaking for hours on organizational theory and geopolitics. His manners were impeccable. Foreign diplomats found him polite, even charming. And yet this same man signed off on the murder of children, designed timetables for extermination, ordered entire villages wiped from existence in retaliation for his own wounding. To confront Heydrich is to confront a terrifying possibility that high intelligence, discipline, and ambition do not inoculate a person from moral collapse. On the contrary, when unmoored from conscience, those traits may become lethal. It's a disturbing truth, and one that challenged the post-war narrative. For decades, society sought to comfort themselves with the idea that only madmen commit atrocity, that evil is always obvious, always coarse, always outside. Heydrich shattered that illusion. He showed us that evil can sit at a desk, smile politely, plan your destruction in quiet, air-conditioned rooms. That's why, even in modern Germany, his name remains radioactive. No monuments were ever built in his honor. No streets were named after him. In fact, in 1945, as Soviet tanks rolled into Berlin and the Third Reich collapsed, Heydrich's grave was quietly lost. His body was buried in the Invalidenfriedhof cemetery, a historic resting place for Prussian officers. But after the war, the grave was unmarked, neglected, and eventually removed. Today, there is no visible sign of where he lies. The ground above him is anonymous. Grass, stone, silence. It's fitting. For a man who tried to erase entire populations, history has tried to erase him. But erasure is not reckoning. In the decades since the war, Europe has tried to come to terms with its darkest chapter. Schools teach the Holocaust not just as history, but as warning. Memorials dot the continent, stumbling stones and sidewalks, walls of names, museums, filled with shoes, glasses, letters. In Prague, statues honor the assassins who struck Heydrich down. In Lidic, the raised village rows of empty chairs represent the murdered children. But the world also had to wrestle with something more abstract and more frightening. How do we prevent another Heydrich? The answer, as painful as it is, lies in vigilance and transparency. Heydrich rose to power not in a vacuum, but in a society that allowed institutions to be hijacked. He used laws to strip rights, used police to enforce ideology, used data to target communities. And he did so gradually, quietly, systematically. That's why so many modern democracies have built checks and balances to prevent any single bureaucrat, no matter how efficient, from gaining too much control. It's why we now emphasize civil liberties, data protection, judicial independence, and whistleblower protections. These aren't just political talking points, they're safeguards against systemic evil. It's also why international courts and human rights bodies exist. The International Criminal Court, the Geneva Conventions, and even institutions like the United Nations Human Rights Council, for all their flaws, are born from the memory of what Heydrich and his colleagues unleashed. But perhaps the deepest, most personal reckoning has been within Germany itself. For decades after the war, there was silence, a kind of national amnesia. Many Germans claimed ignorance of the Holocaust. Some genuinely didn't know. Others didn't want to. But beginning in the 1960s with trials like that of Eichmann and later Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, the truth became inescapable. And with it came the recognition that Heydrich had not been an aberration. He was a product of German society, its nationalism, its wounded pride after World War I, its obsession with order, and its deference to authority. Modern Germany has since become one of the most active countries in confronting its past. It funds Holocaust education worldwide. It prosecutes even elderly former guards. It maintains meticulous archives, and it teaches its children that never again is not a slogan, it's a responsibility. That is the final lesson Heydrich left behind. That memory must be protected, or systems like his will rise again. Because Heydrich didn't need millions to cheer. He didn't need mass rallies or riots. He only needed silence. A few bureaucrats willing to type. A few soldiers willing to follow orders. A few officers willing to look the other way. And in that silence, millions died. Today, in a world once again grappling with rising authoritarianism, mass surveillance, and growing dehumanization in political rhetoric, Heydrich's legacy is not distant. It is alarmingly relevant. The machinery of evil has become more advanced. Data is digitized. Surveillance is automated. Social manipulation is algorithmic. And so the question remains, have we learned enough? Because the next Heydrich may not wear an SS uniform. He may wear a suit. He may speak of efficiency, of national security, of the need to streamline policy, and he may again find a world too tired, too distracted, or too cynical to notice what is being built until it is too late. That's why we study Heydrich. Not to glorify him, not to sensationalize him, but to remember that the greatest threats often come dressed as solutions. And in that sense, Reinhard Heydrich is not just a man from the past, he is a warning from the future. A legacy to remember, the silent warnings of history. As we reflect on the life and legacy of Reinhard Heydrich, we are not merely examining the biography of a man, we are confronting one of the darkest reflections of what happens when brilliance is untethered from morality and when systems are allowed to operate without conscience. For those of us in our later years who have witnessed decades of human progress, conflict and change, the story of Heydrich carries urgent meaning, not just as history, but as a deeply personal reminder of the world we are leaving behind. Heydrich did not shout. He did not command great armies. He did not inspire people with passionate speeches. And yet, through quiet organization and ruthless discipline, he became one of the chief architects of the Holocaust. His genius was not in leadership. It was in logistics, in making mass murder function like a routine operation. He turned genocide into a set of protocols. He showed the world that you don't need to be a monster to commit monstrous acts. You only need to believe in efficiency over empathy, obedience over morality. This is perhaps the most painful and important lesson of all: evil does not always arrive with rage. Sometimes it arrives in silence wrapped in bureaucracy, masked by good manners. For us as elders, many of whom grew up during or shortly after the Second World War, we know how fragile civilization can be. We've seen how quickly freedom can be stolen, not always with tanks and bullets, but with paperwork, surveillance, and fear. And so the story of Heydrich reminds us to be vigilant, not only against hate, but against systems that erode humanity, one form, one signature, one policy at a time. What can we do now, so many years later? We can teach. We can remember. We can speak the truth to our children and grandchildren, not just about what happened, but about how it happened. We can remind them that decency is not automatic, that democracy is not self-cleaning, and that the worst dangers often come from people who appear calm, reasonable, and dangerously well-organized. In our twilight years, we hold a unique kind of wisdom, the knowledge that the world doesn't change in giant leaps. It changes gradually, decision by decision, silence by silence. And so we must never be silent when silence is wrong. We must never be indifferent when lives are on the line. Heydrich's story is not only a warning, it's a mirror. And what we choose to do with that reflection is the legacy we leave behind.